Welcome to Real and Deep Love Stories, where hearts speak louder than words. Tonight's story, He Was My Student, is not just about lessons and classrooms. It's about the boundaries love dares to cross. What begins as simple curiosity becomes an emotional storm, a forbidden connection that grows in silence, in glances, in words left unsaid. It's a journey through awakening, through moments too tender to explain, and choices too painful to escape. Each heartbeat in this story carries truth, the kind of love that changes you forever, even when the world says it shouldn't. So take a breath, close your eyes, and listen. Because some love stories are not written in books, they're lived in secret and remembered for a lifetime. It began on an ordinary afternoon, in a small classroom that smelled faintly of chalk and warm sunlight. The world outside moved with its usual rhythm, cars, voices, the distant hum of the city, yet inside those four walls, something delicate and dangerous started to bloom. He walked in late, shyly apologetic, his books clutched tightly in his hands. There was something in his eyes, not innocence exactly, but openness, like someone unafraid to feel. At first, it was only about lessons, words, grammar, reading, questions asked and answered, the careful exchange of thoughts. But slowly, the lines blurred. He began staying longer after class, asking about meanings not written in the textbook, about people, choices, and dreams. The way he listened felt different. It wasn't the usual politeness of a student. It was deeper, as if he wanted to understand something more than language, maybe the silence behind the words. There were moments when our eyes met for a little too long. Moments when laughter felt too soft, too personal. Sometimes when he said my name, it sounded as though he wasn't asking for help but permission, to feel, to care, to stay. I tried to remind myself of who I was supposed to be, the calm, guiding voice, the one who knows the rules. But something inside began to tremble. The heart doesn't ask for approval, it simply moves toward what feels true. And truth sometimes wears the face of someone you were never meant to love. He brought coffee one morning, nervous but smiling, saying he passed a cafe and thought of me. The cup was warm in my hands, but the warmth spread somewhere deeper. It was nothing, just coffee, just kindness. Yet my heart whispered otherwise. Small gestures became messages, and silences grew louder. There were times I wanted to stop it, to draw the line clearly before it vanished completely. But each time I tried, he would say something simple, a thank you, a question, a joke, and all the walls I built would quietly fall apart. It wasn't his words, it was his presence, the kind that doesn't demand, only waits. Days turned into weeks. Lessons became conversations, and conversations turned into moments neither of us could explain. I began to see him not as a student, but as someone who saw me, not the teacher, not the rules, but the person behind all that. The one who stayed late grading papers, the one who smiled to hide the ache of her own loneliness. There's something both beautiful and cruel about forbidden affection. It teaches you how alive a single heartbeat can feel and how painful it is to silence it. Every time he looked at me, I felt seen. Every time I looked back, I felt guilty for feeling that way. One evening, rain began to fall while we were still in class. The sound filled the room, steady and soft. He stood by the window, watching the drops chase each other down the glass. It's strange, he said quietly. The rain always makes me feel like everything can start again. I wanted to tell him that not everything can. Some things are beautiful only because they can't last. But I said nothing. I just watched the rain and for a moment wished the world outside didn't exist. When he finally left that night, he turned and smiled. Thank you, for more than lessons, he said. My throat tightened. I couldn't ask what he meant, maybe because I already knew. The following weeks were harder. Every class carried a weight I couldn't name. Every word between us felt like a step closer to something we could never have. I told myself it was just a phase, that feelings fade. But this didn't fade, it deepened. It became a quiet ache, something I carried in the pauses between sentences, in the spaces where his name stayed unspoken. Then one day, he didn't come. His chair sat empty, and the room felt hollow. I told myself it was just an absence, just one day, but it stretched into many. And in that space, I realized how much of my world had begun to revolve around him, his voice, his laughter, the quiet energy he brought into my life. When he returned weeks later, he looked older somehow, like someone who had walked through a storm. "I had to leave," he said, "to understand what I wanted." His voice shook slightly, but I realized what I wanted was here. For a moment, everything inside me froze. There was love in his eyes, pure, unguarded, impossible. And there was fear in mine, because love like that can never stay hidden for long. The world notices, the rules return, and hearts are not built to survive both love and judgment. I told him we couldn't, that some loves are meant to be felt, not lived. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He just looked at me for a long moment and nodded, as if he understood that sometimes love itself is the most painful truth. After he left, the days went on: classes, lessons, laughter. Life continued its quiet rhythm, but there's a kind of silence that stays behind, the kind that lives in the spaces where love once breathed. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear his voice, still see that rain falling against the glass. And I remember what it felt like to love someone not because I was allowed to, but because I couldn't help it. Some stories don't end with goodbye. They end with the echo of what could never be, carried softly in the heart where no rule can ever reach days past. But something between us had changed. After that last conversation, the air itself felt different when he entered the room, heavier, almost electric. We spoke the same words, continued the same lessons, yet everything was soaked in an unspoken awareness neither of us dared to name. He sat by the window again, as he always did, and the light would fall across his face in a way that made it impossible not to notice the quiet beauty of him. It wasn't about looks, it was the way he listened, the way his eyes searched for meaning, the way he seemed to understand silence as if it were a language of its own. There were times I tried to look away, to pretend nothing lived in the space between us. But glances became habits, and habits became confessions. Every time our eyes met, it was as if a door opened somewhere inside me, one that I could never fully close again. He never said much beyond what the lesson required, yet every word carried a weight I could feel. When he asked a question, his voice softened near my name, as though it carried something fragile. When he laughed, it broke the stillness like sunlight after rain. And sometimes, when our hands brushed while passing a notebook, the air would still, and the whole world would seem to hold its breath. I told myself it was imagination, that feelings fade if ignored long enough. But they didn't fade, they deepened quietly like roots growing in the dark. Once after class he stayed behind again, pretending to look for something in his bag. I knew he wasn't searching for anything, he just wasn't ready to leave. Neither was I. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words we would never say. Finally, he looked up and said, "Do you ever think about how moments can feel larger than they should?" His voice was calm, but his eyes trembled just a little. I wanted to answer honestly. I wanted to say that every moment with him felt like that, too large, too vivid, too dangerous to belong to ordinary life. But honesty would break us both, so I only smiled and said softly, "Yes, I think I do." He smiled back, and for a long time that was enough. Just the knowing, just the shared silence that felt louder than words. There were small things that only two hearts in hiding could understand. The way his voice lingered when he said goodbye. The way I noticed his handwriting had changed, softer, rounder, as if touched by a secret gentleness. Once he left a folded note on the corner of my desk, a simple line from a poem we'd studied. "What is understood need not be spoken." I never replied, but he knew I had read it. The next day, his smile carried that quiet certainty, as though the line had already said everything. The world around us remained unaware. Lessons continued. Seasons shifted. Yet inside that small classroom, something timeless unfolded, a love that asked for nothing but the right to exist in silence. It was the kind of feeling that could only survive in glances, half smiles, and restrained laughter. Too fragile to name, too real to deny. There were evenings when I would walk home through the rain, replaying small moments in my mind, the tilt of his head when he listened, the thoughtful pause before he spoke. Each memory carried warmth and ache at once. It's strange how desire doesn't always need to touch to be felt. Sometimes it lives quietly in distance, in restraint, in the things we never dare to say. Then came the afternoon when everything almost fell apart. A colleague asked casually why he stayed so long after class, and I felt my heart race before I could answer. It was a harmless question, just curiosity, but it reminded me how fragile the space between us was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I knew the line we walked was getting thinner, that every look, every pause was a risk. The next day, I tried to keep things formal, distant. I spoke with measured tone, avoided his eyes. But when the class ended, he stayed again. He said nothing at first, just waited until the others had gone. Finally, he said, "Did I do something wrong?" The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me. I shook my head but couldn't find the right words. He stepped a little closer, not enough to cross any line, but close enough that I could feel the pull between us. "I don't want to make your life harder," he said quietly, "but sometimes silence feels like a lie." There it was, the truth we'd both carried, laid bare in the smallest whisper. I wanted to tell him that silence was the only way to protect what little we had. That speaking it aloud might destroy it completely. But before I could answer, he smiled, sad, gentle, understanding. "It's okay," he said softly. "Some things don't need to be said." After he left, I sat alone for a long time, staring at the empty chair where he used to sit. The sunlight moved slowly across the floor, and I realized how strange love can be, how it grows in the smallest moments, how it teaches you patience, how it hurts without breaking you. Days turned into weeks again, and though we never spoke of it, something remained, a quiet connection that neither time nor distance could erase. Even when lessons ended, even when the world took him elsewhere, the silence between us kept speaking. Sometimes I still pass that classroom and hear echoes of laughter, see sunlight on the desks, and feel the faint trace of that unspoken bond. It reminds me that love doesn't always need to be declared to be real. Some loves live quietly, beneath words, within the pauses where hearts recognize each other even when lips stay still. And that is how desire learned to speak without ever saying a word. There comes a moment when curiosity stops being harmless, when it begins to burn quietly inside, reshaping everything it touches. I didn't notice it happening at first. It began in the same familiar way: lessons, conversations, 1,000 small exchanges that built the rhythm of our days. But somewhere between the questions he asked and the silences that followed, something changed. It was as if a door had opened without sound, and suddenly I was standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. He had grown in confidence by then, not in arrogance, but in understanding. There was a steadiness in his gaze, a maturity that had quietly taken root. When he spoke now, his words carried thought and warmth, and I found myself listening not as a teacher, but as someone being understood. It's a dangerous thing to feel seen when you've spent years being invisible. One afternoon, the light outside was fading earlier than usual. The classroom was nearly empty, and the golden traces of sunset spilled through the blinds. He was still there, packing his books slowly, as though in no hurry to leave. I sat watching the light shift across the room, feeling the weight of silence growing between us again. He broke it first. "Do you ever think about how people change each other without meaning to?" The question caught me. I looked up and found him watching, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I could give. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think sometimes we meet people who remind us who we really are." He smiled then, not the quick, shy smile from the early days, but one that held something steady, like certainty. "Maybe that's why I never miss your class," he said, his voice softer now. It shouldn't have meant what it did, but it did. The words stayed in the air between us, trembling slightly like something alive. After that, the air never felt quite the same. Every lesson became a balance between what should be said and what shouldn't. I could sense his emotions shifting, deepening no longer the admiration of a student, but something that reached toward me with quiet persistence. I tried to keep distance, to remind myself that it was just attachment, a passing affection that would fade once time carried him forward. But time didn't carry him forward, it carried us both towards something we could no longer ignore. One rainy evening, the campus was nearly empty. I was gathering my things when he appeared at the doorway, soaked from the downpour, a nervous smile flickering on his lips. "I didn't bring an umbrella," he said softly. "Can I wait here until it stops?" The sound of rain filled the room, steady and calm, like a secret rhythm only we could hear. He sat on the edge of a desk near mine, close enough that I could hear the quiet catch of his breath. For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain spoke for us, each drop a reminder of everything that had been held back too long. Then, almost as if speaking to the air, he said, "I used to think love was loud, like fireworks or music." He paused. "But now I think it's this, the quiet that makes everything else disappear. I didn't move, I didn't need to, because in that silence, something inside me awakened something I had buried for years beneath duty, reason, and fear. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, certain, inevitable. I realized that what began as curiosity, a mind drawn to another mind, had become something deeper. It was love, not born of impulse, but of knowing. The kind that arrives without asking permission, the kind that doesn't demand, only exists." He turned toward me, his voice lower now. "You feel it too, don't you?" The truth of it was too heavy to deny and too dangerous to admit. I could only look at him, and that look said everything words could not. The world outside might have called it wrong. Rules would have condemned it, reason would have resisted it, but the heart does not measure love by permission. It only knows what feels real. When the rain finally stopped, neither of us moved right away. He stood there, hands still trembling slightly, and whispered, "I'll go." I wanted to stop him, to ask him to stay, but I knew that if he did, something inside both of us would change forever. So I only nodded, and he walked out into the quiet evening, the sound of his footsteps fading slowly down the corridor. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed over and over in my mind, the quiet, the warmth, the truth of it. I realized that what I felt wasn't something that could be undone by distance or silence. It wasn't infatuation. It was awakening a recognition that life had more color, more meaning because of him. The days that followed were heavier. Every meeting, every word, every shared silence carried the weight of what we both knew but never said again. And yet, even in restraint, there was beauty. Because sometimes love's truest form is not in possession, but in transformation. He began to change too. His confidence grew, his words deepened, his laughter became rarer but fuller. It was as if he had found something within himself through what we shared, a quiet strength, a deeper understanding of the world. And I found something too, a reminder that love isn't always about forever. Sometimes it's about awakening what was asleep inside you. We carried that truth quietly, without declaration, without promise. And though time would take him away, and life would move forward, that one moment in the rain would remain suspended, sacred. It was the moment curiosity became love. And love, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. There comes a time when even the quietest love must face the noise of the world. Ours had lived in silence for so long, in unspoken glances, in shared understanding, in the stillness that existed between words. But silence, no matter how sacred, cannot protect what the world isn't willing to understand. He had begun to talk about the future more often. The way he spoke about it made my heart both ache and swell. All those dreams, so full of life, so open to the world ahead. He would tell me about the cities he wanted to see, the people he wanted to help, the kind of man he wanted to become. And though I smiled and listened, somewhere deep inside, a quiet fear grew, because I knew that future couldn't include me. One evening, as the last class ended, he stayed behind again. The sun had nearly set, leaving the room awash in that soft, uncertain light that makes everything look like a memory. He leaned against the desk and said, "I'll be leaving soon." The words hung in the air, heavy but inevitable. I had known it would come, that moment when time would reclaim what it had briefly allowed us to borrow. I nodded slowly, my voice quiet. "You should." He looked at me then, searching for something, maybe for a reason to stay, or a sign that I wanted him to. But the truth was too heavy for words. "I don't want to go," he said finally, his voice trembling just enough to betray what he tried to hide. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want him to go either. That love, once found, leaves a mark too deep to erase. But I also knew what staying would mean: whispers, judgment, a shadow cast over both our lives. Love shouldn't have to hide, yet ours had only survived because it did. So I said what I knew I must. "You have to live your life. You can't stop because of this." He stepped closer then, close enough that I could feel the quiet ache between us, the heartbeat that matched my own. "It's not just this," he said. "You changed everything." I looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the boy who had once walked in nervously carrying his books, but the man he had become. And in that moment, I realized that love had already done what it was meant to do. It had transformed us, it had given him strength, and it had given me truth. But love, no matter how deep, cannot live where the world forbids it. We stood in silence for what felt like forever. I could hear the faint hum of the evening outside, the echo of voices fading down the hall. Everything else, the rules, the fear, the years between us, seemed far away for one final heartbeat. He whispered, "Will I ever see you again?" I wanted to promise yes. I wanted to believe there could be a place for us beyond the world's reach. But promises are cruel when the truth already knows better. "Maybe," I said softly, "but if not, remember this wasn't a mistake." He closed his eyes then, and I saw the tears he didn't want to show. It's strange how love can hurt most in its gentlest moments. We said nothing more. He picked up his bag, paused at the door, and turned one last time. The look he gave me was both farewell and thank you, the kind of look that stays long after the person is gone. And then he was gone. The days that followed felt hollow, like time had slowed just to remind me what was missing. I still walked into the same classroom, still spoke the same words, still faced the same walls, but the air was different. The sunlight seemed less golden, the laughter quieter. At first, I tried to forget. But love like that doesn't vanish. It settles into the soul like breath, unseen, but always there. Sometimes, in the middle of explaining something, I would catch myself glancing toward the window, expecting to see him there. Sometimes I even imagined hearing his voice again, gentle and certain, saying that line from so long ago, "The rain always makes me feel like everything can start again." But some stories aren't meant to start again. Some are meant to live once, perfectly, and then remain where memory can keep them safe. Years passed, seasons changed, life moved forward. I learned to carry the quiet with me, the kind he left behind. And though I never saw him again, I began to notice how his presence still echoed through my days. The way I listened to people more carefully, the way I taught with patience, the way I looked at the world with softer eyes. Love, when true, doesn't disappear. It reshapes the person it touches. One afternoon, I found a letter waiting at my desk. The handwriting was familiar, slightly slanted, neat but unsteady. It was from him. There were only a few lines, but they were enough to bring everything back. "I'm far away now, but I still carry what you gave me. You taught me more than words. You taught me how to feel." I sat there for a long time, holding the paper, reading those lines over and over until they blurred. There was no address, no signature beyond his first name. Just that simple truth, written softly across the page. I never wrote back. Some things don't need answers. They just need to be remembered. And so, life continued different, quieter, but not empty. Because once love has opened your heart, it never truly closes again. It leaves behind something tender, something permanent. When I think of him now, I don't think of what we couldn't have. I think of what we did, a love that lived in honesty, even when it had to stay hidden. A love that asked for nothing except to be felt, once completely. That was enough if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real and deep love stories that speak to the soul. Every story here reminds us that love, in all its forms, is both beautiful and brave. Stay connected, stay listening, and never stop believing in love, the kind that changes everything. See you in the next story.